Okay, so welcome to the IBNS educational program. We don't need any introduction for Joe. We all know his expertise, and Joe, up to you. Recording has started.
All right, we're going to be talking today about why replica notes are created. It's not always to get rich. Well, the PowerPoint is not advancing. Let me see if I can. There we go. All right, these are the reasons that we'll be talking about. We might have a couple more of these as well. I've turned my video down so that I can see my big monitor better. All right, so sometimes it is so that you can get rich, but there are other reasons as well, which are all listed here. And I'll show examples, at least one and maybe several of each of those lines. Now I need to switch over to a different, all right, are you seeing now two banknotes? I'm seeing reasons.
No, just a gray screen right now.
A gray screen, okay. Let me come back then to the WebEx screen, where I was, I guess. I was there, right?
Now you're back to the reasons.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing that screen and go to sharing a different screen. Okay, now do you see two notes?
Yes.
Okay, we're ready from here then, hopefully. All right, here is an example of a counterfeit made to deceive the public. There's the original note from the provincial of Manchuria, which is a nicely made intaglio note, probably printed in Beijing. It's Tianjin here is the place of issue. Counterfeit, which is not a bad counterfeit, but it's not intaglio. And when we get to the back, well, it's not two slides. Okay, here's the back. There's the original intaglio back. And there's the much less attractive letterpress back of the counterfeit. There's a note that circulated in China in the early part of the 20th century, intended to be in commerce. Here's a note that was created by the Japanese during World War II to use in international trade to buy war material. This is actually a nationalist Chinese printing plant near Hong Kong that was captured by the Japanese intact. They overran it, picked up the presses, the inks, the plates, and the technicians. And because this note had value in international commerce, it was one of the four major Chinese banks that issued what was called FAPI, F-A-P-I, which was a nationalist currency. It could be used in international commerce. So the Japanese decided they were just going to continue to print this, but instead of leaving the plant intact and working right there on the ground where they captured it, they took everything to Tokyo, set it all up in Tokyo. By the time they got it installed and operating, the value of the file had deteriorated so badly that the notes that they had plates for were virtually worthless. So they went to all that effort for no avail. I have not yet identified a marker that can distinguish between the notes that were printed in Tokyo and the notes that were printed in China. I have a specimen of this note, of what we call a bureau specimen, an original specimen, and I have a sheet of 6 pieces that I bought in Tokyo. I've seen one other sheet of 6 pieces in the marketplace, so I'm suspecting that those came from a Japanese operation. Not necessarily, because this stuff moves around in the market, quite easily. Which is why I want to someday sit down and go over the note line by line and see if I can find a marker, because counterfeiters do like to sign their work. Now, a few years ago, actually at this point, many years ago, notes of this issue entered the marketplace with all these rubber stamps all over them. Well, these are all printer's waste. Notes that either the note itself or some other note on the sheet was defective, and they were all rubber stamped to indicate whether there was a problem with the tints, or a problem with the intaglio plate, or a problem with the serial numbering. You find these with mismatched serial numbers. I have one someplace, but I haven't, it's buried in my boxes of unaccessioned material. So all of these ones that have these rubber stamps on, well, I thought I had 2 of them illustrated here, are printer's waste, which came into the market, I guess, sometime in the 1980s, or possibly the very early 1990s. And whether they originated from the plant in Tokyo or the plant in China is unknown. I suspect that they sat around in China in a warehouse someplace, ignored until somebody stumbled across them and said, hey, these might be marketable, and started selling them. But we don't know that for sure. Okay, the next reason I indicated there was to finance clandestine operations. These note types were issued by the Japanese in their occupation areas in Southeast Asia. There were 5 series of Japanese invasion money: Burma, Malaya, the Philippines, Oceania, and it's slipping my mind now what the other one was. But we had teams operating in Burma. There were actually, the British and the US both had teams operating in Burma. And both the British and the US counterfeit these Burmese notes for use behind the lines. Their teams operating to disrupt Japanese operations in Burma. They couldn't get adequate support of these, just by walking into a bank and knocking it off, because their teams were not large enough to fight the Japanese army directly. They were always operating in the shadows, and they needed currency to finance their operations. So they both asked their controlling organizations in London and in Washington to counterfeit the notes of Burma and Malaya, and eventually the Netherlands East Indies as well. The British counterfeits, well, the Burma note, the original Burma note, was a lithograph note, which made it very easy to replicate. The original Malaya note and the Netherlands East Indies notes were intaglio, but they were in fact replicated by both governments, not both types by both governments, in intaglio. But we do is to distinguish the counterfeits from the genuines. If you look at the backs of these notes, the Burma were first to be counterfeited by the Americans. The British counterfeited the Milan notes first. The backs look exactly alike, except for the 10 rupees counter here, and this ocean scene with the sailboat or the ocean liner out here in the distance. What happened was that having counterfeited the Burma piece, they just stripped this out of the plate, inserted this scene to counterfeit the Malayan piece, ignoring the fact that there were, in fact, minor differences in these frames. Maybe they didn't tumble to the fact that there were differences in the frames, but eventually they did, because eventually they corrected their error. But most of the counterfeits that you encounter of the Malayan piece from the American side have a defect right down in here. You see this little low arch right in this area right here. Piece, the arch is high, but the counterfeits of the Malayan piece from the Americans have the Burma arch. It's a very distinctive difference there. There's also this little very short line here up in this gutter, which is on the original and was removed from the counterfeits. Now, the British counterfeit of the Burma note had no watermark. That's its distinction. They used the proper plate. They did not remove the mark on their Burma counterfeits, but the paper has no watermark. So that's an easy way to distinguish the British counterfeits of the Burma note. The U.S. counterfeit of the Burma note had that little line moved. It was on watermark paper. We replicated the paper as well as replicating the plates. So the only distinction between the U.S. counterfeit of the Burma note and the original is the presence or absence of that little line right there. And there are lots of other distinctions that you can use to separate the counterfeit from the genuine Burma, Malaya, and Netherlands East Indies pieces. The Philippine and the Oceania pieces were never counterfeited by, well, I take that back. The U.S. did counterfeit the first series of Philippine gem. The Oceania were never counterfeited by either government, and the Philippine gem were not counterfeited by the British, but they were counterfeited by the U.S. for exactly the same reasons. Those notes were taken into the Philippines over the beaches off of submarines and given to the Philippine guerrillas who were operating behind Japanese lines all through the war. So I'm not going to go into all the details here of how you distinguish them. You can find that in the literature. But the point was that it was to finance clandestine operations. Here's another example of a note that was, let's go back to that slide. That shows you the difference between the genuine Malaya piece and the U.S. counterfeit of the Malaya piece. Another example of a note that was counterfeited for use by friendly forces behind Japanese lines. The Japanese never formally occupied Thailand, but they did have financial interests in Thailand. They made an agreement with the Thai government. We won't occupy you as long as you give us most of your rice. And so the Thais were providing tons of rice to the Japanese all through the war in exchange for not being formally occupied. But to disrupt those operations, there were an organization called the Free Thai Movement that were operating against the Japanese, and they needed currency to operate with. So the British went to Delarue, these notes, and asked Delarue to replicate the notes for use by their forces. And Delarue said, go away, get lost. You're not our customer. The Thai government is our customer. So the British confiscated the plates from Delarue and then handed the plates back and said, now print them. And the Delarue did in fact print them in 3 denominations, 1, 5, and 10 baht. But they modified the plates before they did that, secretly. They didn't tell the British government they were marking these plates so the Thais could repudiate the counterfeits after the war, but they did it, which is a gross operational security violation because the Japanese had ever tumbled to how these plates had been modified. And although some of the modifications you need a magnifying glass, some you do not, then anybody who got caught with one of these modified notes would be off with his head, which is not a good situation for your friendly forces. Here's one of the counterfeit notes. These are called the Free Thai notes in Thailand. The 1 baht is extremely rare because apparently they were all used up in circulation. The 5 and 10 baht do occur at auction in Thailand, and it's a good cherry picking opportunity because most people aren't aware of these distinctions. We're going to be looking at this corner right up here and this gutter right here and a little bit right up here to see what the modifications are. There's the original Delarue note with a shading line going all the way up to the top and actually overlapping at the top a little bit. Top shading line was removed. When you get over to the gutter, here's the original Delarue product, almost touching the shading lines to the next character over. And there's the counterfeit. Now this is a naked eye diagnostic. You can see this easily with the naked eye. So that would be an extremely dangerous change to make if you're trying to protect your forces. This little protuberance here also is longer. See, there's the original, and there's the counterfeit. And then up in that last area, we have 3 shading lines here, long, medium, and short, which become only 2 shading lines, with the short one completely gone and the longer one extended. And there are other little modifications as well. There's a change in here. There are lots of changes throughout that plate. You can see the original here looks like it has an ox's head with horns, and on the counterfeit those horns have been removed. So these were introduced into Thailand, and they mostly got used up in circulation. As I said, the ones apparently completely were used because they're very rare. I've never actually seen one. I've only seen the report in the IBNS journal illustrating the diagnostics on the 1 baht note. But I own the 5 baht that we're looking at here, and I also own the 10 baht, which I cherry picked out of a Lynn Knight auction in Memphis a few years ago. All right, another reason is to destroy confidence in a currency. This is a note that was created by the Japanese Central Reserve Bank of China, which is a Japanese puppet bank in Nanking. I'm sorry, in Shanghai. The notes are dated 1940. The bank was founded in very late 1939, and the notes were first issued in 1940. They're full intaglio with a very complex tint structure behind the intaglio plate. The original notes in this design were brown face and a brown back, and they were replaced sort of shortly later, and I don't know why, with these violet face and violet back. Here's a counterfeit of that note, which is lithographed, or it might be letterpress. I don't remember how the counterfeit's made, but it's certainly not intaglio. And you can see that the serial number is very defective. The serial number is it's a dead giveaway. And the back of this violet note, brown. There was no original note that was violet on the face and brown on the back. This, anytime you find one that's a bicolored note, different color face from back, you're looking at one of the counterfeits. Now, we don't know who did this counterfeit. We have records from the U.S. CIA, which were originally records of the Office of Strategic Services, who was the government arm that was counterfeiting the Japanese invasion money. In those records, it says that the Japanese or the British had counterfeited the notes of this bank with no other information about what note had been counterfeited. But this is the only early in the war note that we know of that was counterfeited, and so we're attributing this to the British government. But whether that's correct isn't really known. There are lots of other counterfeits of the notes of this bank. Later in the war, there's a 5,000 yuan note, which I must have 7 or 8 different productions of counterfeits, was heavily counterfeited in China during the war. But as I said, we don't know who created this counterfeit, but it was earlier. This note went out of circulation fairly early because it got inflated out of use. All right, propaganda. There's lots of examples of notes that have been replicated to be used for propaganda. This is one the U.S. dropped on North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. In 3 denominations, 1, 5, and 10 dong. The original notes are intaglio. They were printed in China for the North Vietnamese government. Notes are lithographed. They were printed at a U.S. Army U.S. Navy printing plant on Guam, a field printing plant, with this tab on the end, which has the propaganda message. And there's a message on both sides. And across the 3 denominations, there are probably 9 or 10 different combinations of message and denomination. So you have a fairly wide range of these to collect if you're trying to collect every one of them. If you cut this tab off, this is a fairly good counterfeit. It's lithographed, but this variegated tint here, which is a true variegated tint, a progressive tint on the original note, runs from this gray-green over here to this blue, the gray-green over here on the other side. Very gradually changing in color. That's the security printer does that. You can't do that at your local corner job printer where you go to get your church flyers printed. That was replicated by the printing plant on Guam by gradually reducing the intensity of the gray-green over here as it moved across and then picked up again on the other side. So instead of having the 2 inks applied to the press at the same time, inking the plate with this gradual shift in color, which is a very difficult thing to create and to maintain, because that change in color tries to switch around across the plate. this was done with lithographic process, but it's very deceptive. I mean, you really truly need to have a magnifying glass to tell that difference. Now, of course, you can feel the difference with your finger if you have really sensitive fingers, because this is intaglio and this is not intaglio. But circulate one of these lightly and cut the tab off, and it becomes a very potent tool to try to disrupt the economy at the same time that you're passing a propaganda message. Because everybody who handles one of these things is going to be very leery of trying to spend it, because if they get caught spending one of the counterfeits, it's likely to not go very well with them. Here's another example from the U.S. side. This is a 25 dinar note that was being used in Iraq at the time of the first Gulf War in 1990-91. These were printed in Switzerland, and they were called the Swiss dinars by the Iraqis. There were two series of counterfeits of these prepared. This was the first one, and you can see that it's not at all deceptive. You could never succeed in spending one of these. And it had a propaganda message on the back. There were, I don't remember, 3 or 4 different messages on the backs of these notes. The Saudi Arabians who were hosting us while we were building up in the Middle East, preparatory to actually invading Iraq in early 1991, said, we don't want anybody screwing around with the currency. You may not use these propaganda pieces. So they were put into storage, not used, and are quite scarce today. You almost never run across one of these CIA printed products. But eventually we told the Saudis to get bent, and we did create a full color replica of the face with a propaganda message on the back. This is the only one that has a color propaganda message, a cartoon with the poor beleaguered Iraqi soldiers supporting Saddam Hussein. And I don't remember what the translation of the Arabic legend is here, but the soldier's not very happy. And there were 5 of those different propaganda messages used. Now, these were lithographed at an Army field printing plant outside Heidelberg in Seckenheim, Germany, just a few miles from where I was working at the time. And I knew these things were being made out there, and I never got my tail in gear to go out there and see if they would let me take a look at the operation at the plant. They probably wouldn't have. They told me to go away. You don't have a need to know. But I at least should have gone out there and tried to take a look. So here's the original, and you can see that ours is so much smaller. Well, these were so popular that the propaganda notes were then counterfeited for sale to collectors. There were at least 2 different series of counterfeits of the propaganda note. So there's the original intaglio piece done in Switzerland for the Iraqi government. Here's our lithograph piece done in Germany. There's our piece on top. The first counterfeit went back to the proper size. So the counterfeit is larger than the original propaganda leaflet. And you can see the reproduction is somewhat inferior. You lose some detail. The serial numbers of all the replicas, ours and the counterfeit leaflets, are exactly the same. The second counterfeit of the leaflet, now in the proper size, but distinctly different in color. If you collect these things and you watch for them, you can pick this out of a junk box very quickly as not being one of our originals. So there are 2 counterfeits of the counterfeit. That's not the first time that's happened either. All right, next line on that slide said to take advantage of a currency reform. Currency reform is a great time for counterfeiters to operate for 2 reasons. There's a lot of currency going through the banks during the reform period. Currency reforms usually take place over a period of just a few days or a very limited number of weeks, while all the old currency is taken in and all the new currency is issued. And the basic note here was printed by the Japanese late in the war, is lithographed. It's a fairly crude piece as paper money goes. You can see it has no true serial numbers, it has only block numbers. We created a new note in 1946 to replace this note in circulation, which was intaglio. Went back to use the old, early in the war plates to create a note to issue in 1946 at the 1946 currency reform. But there wasn't enough of them made. So the old notes had to be recalled into use and validated with this stamp stuck on the upper right corner. The stamp is intaglio. The counterfeit here is a counterfeit stamp on a genuine original note. The rubber stamp here says no value, meaning that the note itself is of no value because it post-dated the currency reform. It was made after the currency reform occurred, but the stamp is lithographed. The stamp is not an intaglio stamp, and you can see the color is a little off as well. Color might have been better when it was new, but over the years the color may have shifted a little bit. And the little rubber stamps, the three small rubber stamps here say counterfeit. So it's the stamp that's counterfeit, not the note, but the note has no value. So as I said, the currency reform is a great time for counterfeiters to operate because there's a lot of currency going through the banks. And the second reason is that the public doesn't yet know what the new notes are supposed to look like. So if they get an early issue of the new note and, within a few days create a copy of that and get it into circulation, even though it may be of inferior quality, when they try to use it and somebody says, I don't like the looks of this note, and they say, oh, that's the new one. That one just came out 3 days ago. Haven't you seen any of these yet? And they pass it that way. So there's counterfeit reform time, or currency reform time is a great time for counterfeiters to be in operation. Now these days, these stamps are being replicated on inkjet or on laser printers. I have 2 or 3 examples of these stamps that were printed on a laser printer, which were done for collectors in the collector's market today. So there's another example of a far delayed response to a currency reform. Next reason I gave was to sell to get hard currency. The North Koreans issued this series in 1947. They called them in, I think it's 1951 or maybe 52. I don't remember when they were called in, but it was during the Korean War period. The original notes were printed in Russia on Russian paper with a repeating star watermark. It's not a distinct star. It gives you the impression of stars if you look at a whole note or an unprinted sheet. In the 1980s, the Korean government, needing to get hard currency to finance the lifestyle of their plutocrat, autocrat upper tier, reprinted these notes from the original plates on plain paper, straight white bond paper, and sold them as souvenirs through various sources. Hong Kong was their principal outlet. And these were actually advertised in the IBNS Journal from a Hong Kong seller, which was a front for the North Korean government. I don't recall that they were advertised as replicas. I think they were advertised as 1947 production. At that time, anything North Korean had long been under embargo in the U.S. It was illegal to import North Korean stamps. Stamp collectors could not legally bring North Korean stamps into the country. I was the general advertising manager for the IBNS when this ad came in. I inquired with the Secret Service about whether we could legitimately advertise these notes in the journal, and they said if it's money or used to be money, it's not subject to the embargo, and yes, it can be brought into the country or sold to American citizens overseas. So I accepted the ad. The ad ran for a year and was not repeated. I expect they probably didn't get very much traffic. You can make out here elements of the watermark. It just looks like mottled paper, unless you can see a large portion of it fairly unencumbered by print and make out the repeating stars, black and white stars, throughout the paper. But you can see that this one, there's nothing in the paper at all. These are shot on a light box. So what we're looking at here is a note with light coming through from the back side. And you can see the text on the back showing through on the face here because it's sitting on a light box. Now we get to the counterfeits that are made for collectors. The counterfeits of this note were created to sell to collectors. This is a very late war example of a note that was circulating in Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state in North China, which was established in 1931 when there's a long history of Japanese involvement in North China, dating all the way back to the first Sino-Japanese War of 1895, and then the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5, and then finally the Sino-Japanese War, Second China Incident of 1931, leading up to 1937, when full-out war between China and Japan originated. World War II did not start in Poland in 1939. It started in China in 1937. Well, this note was created in Manchukuo by the puppet government from genuine plates. The imprint was changed from the Japanese imprint. They were originally printed in Japan by the Cabinet Printing Bureau, and the imprint was changed to say Imperial Manchu Printing Bureau product of. They apparently didn't have enough serial numbering machines in North China to put 2 serials on these notes. So these late war pieces have only a single serial number. The block is italic rather than being straight up and down Roman characters like these blocks. And the backs are this color. The original color was brown. The color of the notes printed in Japan was brown. The notes printed in Manchuria were printed in this light violet. Apparently they didn't have the proper brown ink. Well, the counterfeit of this note done for collectors does have the proper brown back. And it has a letterpress plate. And they didn't have the capability of printing this progressive tint. The original tint is a true progressive tint, going from yellow-brown over here to pale blue or blue-green, back to yellow-brown over here. The counterfeit, you can see, has distinct lines between the 2 elements, the 2 colors of that tint. So this looks fairly crude. This looks very crude. The serial number looks very crude. This one happens to be an error. The serial number is in two pieces. The 5314 is steady, constant on all the pieces, and then the last two digits change. So they had a two-digit numbering machine that they married up against the static typeface here, and you can see the type font is not the same size. It's not even identical to the one that they were using next to it. And for some reason, this note went through the serial numbering twice and got this doubled image here before it went through the final numbering, which had the rotating number. So this does not fool anybody as being one of these. But at the time these were made, these were very scarce. China was not yet open to commerce with the West. These notes were unknown in the West. They were uncatalogued in the West. So if you got one of these in your hand and you knew that they were an emergency production, that they'd been made late in the war under stressful conditions, it was easy for the maker to pass these as saying, well, this was the product that was being made. This is what you expect to find in 1945. Well, that in fact wasn't true, because 1945, the Manchurian printing plant was turning out an intaglio product with a true progressive tint, and the only distinction was it only had one serial number. But these, the first one of these I ever got cost me $500 or $600, and these were coming out at about that same price, in the $400 to $500 range, because these were unknown. These were the only things coming out for collectors. Once China opened up, a lot more of these came out. These are now, the price on these has dropped to $200 or $300. The price on these, of course, has gone through the floor because they're recognized now as not being genuine products. And here you can see the distinction between the two plates. The last reason that I had on there was to sell to tourists. This was the Japanese invasion money for Oceania. There was only 4 denominations, a half shilling, 1 shilling, 10 shilling, which is scarce, and a 1 pound. And they were used in the British colonies in the South Pacific, places like the Solomon Islands. They could have been used for an invasion of Australia had the Japanese wanted to go into Australia, but they never had any intention of trying to breach that border. They did bomb Darwin several times, so the war did reach Australia, but these were not created specifically to use for an invasion of Australia. They were to use in the areas of the South Pacific that were originally under British control and then were taken over by the Japanese during the war. In Brisbane, there was a stationery shop that decided that these would make good souvenirs. These notes were used in Guadalcanal. We had a lot of troops going through Guadalcanal, U.S. Army and U.S. Marines. Troops want something to send home to Susie. They want something to send home as a souvenir of their experience in the war. And there were not enough of these to go around. Now, of course, they weren't sending them from Guadalcanal. They were sending them home from Australia once they got down to Australia on rest and recuperation leave. There wasn't a lot of mail coming in and out of the war zone on the contested islands during the fighting. But when the fighting was over, then it was nice for a GI to be able to pick up one of these notes and put his name on it and say, Best wishes from Fred out here in the Pacific, somewhere in the Pacific. They weren't allowed to put where they were because that wouldn't get past the censor. So this fellow in Brisbane replicated these notes. It's a very crude replica. He even, well, he did use the used the proper color for the blocks, and then on the back he put on the word replica. He was not attempting to sell these as genuine Japanese products. He was being quite open about the fact that what he was selling was a copy of the Japanese product. He made these in 3 denominations only. He didn't apparently never stumbled across a 10-shilling note. He did not replicate the 10-shilling note. Well, the Australian government didn't really like this. They didn't like, just like the Saudi Arabians, they didn't want anybody messing with the currency. Even though this currency never had any value in Australia and was marked as a replica, they still didn't want this guy doing this, but they couldn't figure out a way to invoke the anti-counterfeiting laws. So they finally invoked the paper rationing regulations. They said this is not an authorized use of paper in wartime, and so they shut him down. They confiscated his plates and his stock, and he graciously gave it up and went out of the business of making these. Well, somebody else jumped on that bandwagon and created another replica, a much more accurate replica, but without the colored blocks and without the tint in the background. This has got a gray-green tint in the background. This has no tint there at all. We don't know who did these. We presume somebody else in Australia. I think, if I remember correctly, this is the only replica 1 shilling other than the Brisbane pieces. But the £1 note was subject to several counterfeiters. You see, there's no indication here that this is a replica. Now, here's the original Japanese £1. Look at this guilloche over here, this 10-lobed guilloche in pale blue. That was difficult to replicate because they were using photographic processes to make the replicas of these notes. And that did not copy well. So they took the guilloche off the back of the note. There's the guilloche on the Brisbane replica. And it's this guilloche right here, which appears twice on the back of the note, which he copied from the back and then placed on the face. Well, all the other counterfeiters had the same problem, so they did that as well. Here's the Brisbane replica, and then here's one example in a dark green, and you can see there's that same guilloche used over here. There's an example in olive green. There's an example in bright green. And there are differences in plates as well. So we know that there was more than one replicator making these notes for sale to GIs in Australia. Now, I don't know if any of these ever got out to the islands, to where the GIs were fighting. We do have this short snorter from a USO show that had Phyllis Brooks, Gary Cooper, and Una Merkel, who were all Hollywood actors, actresses, among others. Some of the other signatures on this note were probably GIs. And this Nathan Braunstein down here, I haven't been able to trace, but I suspect that he was a manager of this show because it looks like the same pen was used for all of these 4 signatures. I'm sure he was with the USO troop. But we don't know where this USO was actually being performed. It probably was not being performed out in the islands where the fighting was going on. It was probably in Australia where the rest and restoration camps were, where troops were pulled out of the Pacific sent to Australia to refit and rest up, and there would be a USO show there at the time. This one was created years later, and you can see they're still using that same guilloche, but it's all one color. This was for a Marine Corps reunion long after the fighting was over. And finally, the last piece I have is one of the typical pieces you find at any theme park that's made on artificially aged paper. You open up the envelope that has some of these in it and stick your nose in there, the ammonia smell will knock you over, because some kind of an ammonia chemical is used to age this paper to try to replicate a note that was, vintage 200 years ago. This was dated 1862. So this was a banking operation in Philadelphia during the Civil War. That and I don't know what theme park these notes were being sold at, or what state welcome center they were being sold at, but you find no end of this kind of replica of both Confederate States notes and colonial notes from the U.S. War of Independence in the 1870s, a full 100 years before that. Lots of these. So that's the last piece I have to show you. Let me turn my own camera up here so we can see each other, and let me see if I can stop sharing. Figure out where the stop button is here. Questions? Were you watching the chat screen, Fabrizio?
Yeah, because everyone is on mute. So if you have questions, please unmute yourself and ask. If I unmute everyone, I'm worried that we may have some echo behind.
Right.
Any question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Christian Bold, I'm from Romania. About polymer.
Well, I've seen many fakes on real polymer. I've seen fakes of polymer notes made on paper with cellophane in the windows. What's mostly happening with polymer is that shysters are removing ink from polymer notes and passing them off as errors. There's all kinds of solvents that you can use to take the ink off of a polymer note and make it look like a misprint, and then try to sell it for hard money that way. But that's what I'm experiencing in terms of counterfeits of polymer notes.
Hi, my name is Rukmini. I had two questions actually. First one was I really like that the Thai example, where Delarue played its little part of being, I guess, fair to its client, to the Thai government. And
Right.
Even though they were kind of forced upon by the British government to reprint the notes, I think they kept really nice and professional of them to still, maintain the dignity of their original client. So I think that was a really great story. I haven't read or heard about it, so thanks for sharing that. The second question actually was regarding, you showed us a lot of examples of the counterfeits, the replicas, which are, they try to match the quality, or they're a bit lower or weaker in terms of quality. But there is this whole concept of the super dollar, that the United States dollar is actually counterfeited to look better than the real thing. So have you looked at any of those examples also to kind of make out if a note looks so good that it may not be the real thing?
Well, super notes super notes exist. There's no question about that. They've come from more than one source. The original ones came out of the Middle East, but we don't know where they were actually produced. I have one that came out of Russia that has Cyrillic markings on it indicating that it's a counterfeit. So I expect that it was created somewhere behind the Iron Curtain, Eastern Europe. And Koreans were the most recent ones to create those, and they were marketing those out of Macau and also through the Irish Republican Army. The IRA was financing its operations by getting these counterfeit notes from North Korea. I'm sure that the U.S. government would have no reason to try to replicate its own notes. There's plenty of state operatives in Washington that can get financing for who knows what kinds of clandestine operations, and there wouldn't be any reason for him to try to use counterfeited notes, because if it were discovered that that was what they were using to finance their operations, the operation would lose its credibility. What they're trying to pay off with these notes wouldn't want them. So I'm reasonably sure the super notes originated outside the U.S. We cover super notes in the course at the ANA. When I teach this course at the ANA, it's a 4-day course, and on one of those days, we cover modern U.S. currency. The rest of the course deals with mostly foreign or U.S. obsolete currencies, both federal currency that's no longer in circulation, or what term obsolete notes, the pre-federal currencies from the state and locally chartered banks of the 19th century. But super notes do get addressed in that course.
Not quite super notes, which are the $100, but I was in America in a store, and I handed over some new $100 bills. Remember, I go over there and I get jeans for Peter and stuff, and the machine said that they were forgeries. And she called the security guard over immediately, and I was ever so worried that I brought over a load of forgeries. And she tried it again and again, and it turned out they were so new, the machine was finding it difficult to cope with them. But they were good notes. But I was really worried that I had a load of forgeries on me, which I really obviously shouldn't have. so machines find it very hard to cope with brand new notes as well.
Well, that's true. The machines have to be updated whenever a change is made in the security features of the notes. And of course, mostly the public is not told what all the security features are. The ones that you can inspect with the naked eye, the public is educated about. We had a case of a YN, a young numismatist, who came down from Canada to the summer seminar in Colorado Springs and had bought some U.S. currency from his bank in Canada, and one of them was a counterfeit 100, which I reimbursed for. I took it off his hands. You don't find very many circulating counterfeit hundreds in the U.S. because not very many people use hundreds. The most common circulating note in the U.S. is a 20, and you don't see them frequently, but some place like a 7-Eleven or a dollar store will be one or two counterfeits trying to be passed through there, or successfully passed through there, because if you have one counterfeit and you mix it in with 2 or 3 other notes, and they're just looking at the counters in the corners, it goes into the till and nobody looks at it carefully until it gets paid out again.
I have actually had a couple of forged $100 bills, and when I knew I was going to the States, I knew the one thing I would not do would be to take them over there, because the last thing I'd want to be caught with would be a forged, a terrible condition, really ragged and horrible. But that was many years ago. But the last place I wanted to take them was America, because I know it would be a really bad thing if I was caught with them.
Yeah, it wouldn't go down well.
Bruce here, question.
Yes, sir.
I've run across reports. Let me back up here. In the collector community, there are several examples of where specimens are much rarer than issued notes, and I've seen reports of the Chinese using modern laser ablation technology to convert issued notes into specimens, erasing all the serial numbers very carefully, as I say, using laser ablation techniques, and replacing it with all zeros, for example, and creating a specimen out of a more common issue note. Have you run across such a thing, and how difficult are these to detect?
Well, I have several. I have two specimens from the People's Republic of China issues, both the 1947-48 series and the intermediate series, the 80s and 90s. They're not hard to detect at 20 power. They're, unless you know what you're looking for, a hand loop might not pick up the replication. The best place to look is at the serial number, because if they remove the original serial numbers, then the tint that serial number was printed on top of also partially removed and had to be restored before they put the new serial number on it. The new serial numbers and the specimen markings are put on with either laser or silk screen. And I do have some in letterpress as well. Not the specimen markings. The specimen markings were silk screen. Serial numbers were letterpress. But the damage to the original note under that serial number is readily visible at 20 power. It's often a lot less visible at lower magnifications. Your best friend in counterfeit detection is a 20 power glass. Your second best friend is an ultraviolet lamp, because under UV you can find all kinds of evidence of tampering with a note which are invisible in white light.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I want to talk about the legality of having in your collection counterfeit notes. I mean, it's illegal to use them, but is it legal to actually possess them and collect them? Because, I mean, you do occasionally find these counterfeit notes. Is it okay to actually keep them in your collection without, is it illegal? It's the legality of it.
Well, it depends on what the note is. If it's a note which is no longer has monetary value, if it's a note that's been demonetized, then there's no problem at all. No U.S. federal currency has ever been demonetized, so technically it's illegal to try to pass what's called utter, UTTER, a counterfeit of any vintage of U.S. notes. The Secret Service doesn't chase after the obsolete U.S. notes, the large size ones. They do go after small size ones. They're not so interested in the series of 1930s and 40s as they are in the modern series. There are two schools of thought on the legality of holding them without trying to spend them. There are lawyers who say that it's not illegal to possess them, but it is illegal to refuse to surrender them. So if the Secret Service knocks on your door and says, "We think you've got some counterfeits here, we want them," you have to give them up. But he would defend court saying it wasn't illegal to possess them as long as he gave them up upon demand. Treasury says, no, we're still going to prosecute people for simple possession. So that has not been tested in court yet. We haven't had a case go through the courts where a collector is prosecuted for simple possession. But of course, it's always best not to advertise that you have these things around. I do have a substantial number of small size, current U.S. counterfeits because I teach counterfeit detection, and I'll use them as examples. But if I ever get that knock on the door, I'm going to have to give them up. What stresses me is that they'll take everything, including all the genuine notes I have as comparison examples, and say, well, we'll give you the genuines back later, and I will never see them again. Yes, sir. Cedrian.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I've always found really interesting your actual interest about counterfeits. Well, I have three questions or comments as well. One is Interpol since the late 20s has been keeping record of all the forgeries. Actually, I managed to buy one of these counterfeits and forgeries volume, which as you can see is quite large. And this is only the US piece. I think that there is another volume for foreign currencies. So have you had any conversations with people from Interpol and how do you think their approach to track counterfeits is? Do you think that they are actually paying attention on all the same details that a numismatist is considering?
Well, what's interesting about the counterfeit detection of that period is that they were using the plate numbers and the series numbers as their identifying diagnostic. They weren't carrying around magnifying glasses. Somebody in some laboratory somewhere was looking at the notes that were being suspected and saying, okay, this one is bad. This is a series of 1950 Charlie, and it's plate number 2392 faceplate, and it's a $10 bill. And that's what they would publish. They would publish the faceplate number, the series number. And so if you got a suspicious note, you'd look in these tables and see if this note had been reported as a counterfeit. And if you thought your piece was bad, then you would pick it up. A banker would. A store clerk would try to pass it on. I had that happen to me in a post exchange in Heidelberg, Germany. I'm sorry, in Munich, in 1967. I was at that time trying to collect U.S. type notes of the early series that were still circulating in Germany at that time. I could buy large size notes at face value in the Japanese and the German central banks in Munich. But I visited the cashier's window at the PX about once a week to see what he had there in early small size U.S. notes. And one day he had a counterfeit 20, and he had a genuine 20 of the same series. I could show him the two pieces and say, I want the genuine note for my collection. I can't afford to buy the counterfeit, but you should turn that in at the bank. Well, I asked him the next time I saw him, and he said it went in his deposit, and nobody ever questioned it. But it in fact was a counterfeit. It had no silk threads in the paper. I, at that point, was not sophisticated enough to be able to tell the difference between lithographed and intaglio notes, but I could see there were no silk threads in the paper. So that's one of my stories about a counterfeit that I actually encountered in circulation. My wife picked up a $10 bill off the ground outside the library 2 or 3 years ago, and handed it to me, and I looked at it and said, well, it's a good thing you didn't try to put this in your wallet, because it's a fake. It's an inkjet job that somebody had wadded up and thrown on the ground outside the library. I don't know what the story there was. As far as Interpol goes, Interpol and the Secret Service do have reciprocity agreements. So if the British the Secret Service comes across fake sterling notes in the U.S., they'll confiscate them and turn them over to the British. Or if they find fake euros, they'll confiscate those and turn them over to whoever they're talking to on the other side. And Interpol has, the same kinds of agreements on their side. They'll confiscate bad notes that they encounter and try to prosecute passers of bad notes over there as well. They both have good laboratories. They both have, good detection techniques. They know secrets about these notes that I don't know. I'm not privy to the classified information about, for instance, were any super notes actually made in Colombia? It seems that most of the Colombian counterfeits were lithographed. Now, they got out of that business and passed it to the Peruvians. And all the Peruvian counterfeits, which are being used, are lithographed. But they're very high quality. They're even putting the threads into the paper. The polymer threads are being inserted into the paper. Paper's not being manufactured that way. They have some mechanical technique that they use, which I've seen videos of threads being placed into paper. I don't know what it is they're doing to prepare this paper to take a thread, but these are lithographed notes with, appear to be legitimate polymer threads embedded in the paper, which are counterfeits from the word go, but very good counterfeits. We have cooperative agreements with those governments, and you may recall about a year ago there was a big takedown in Peru, simultaneous arrests of 20 or 30 operatives all around Peru, where huge quantities, millions of dollars worth of U.S. counterfeits were seized in one raid.
And another question is, there is this threshold about, I don't know if it is 150 or 200 banknotes, forged banknotes per million, that actually considers, the central banks consider as a very dangerous for the economy. I recall back in 2011-12, the Mexican Polymer 50 peso was forged and increased this threshold. And the central bank decided to create a new design with enhanced security features. So, do you know other stories about the increased number of counterfeits that actually went into circulation and that obliged another country to replace the whole denomination? I think that Australia did that, and that's why they started producing, experimenting with polymer. But do you have other examples of countries that had to replace either a full family or actually a denomination because of the large quantities of forgers?
The most famous of those were the Bernard counterfeits of World War II against the white notes. It caused the British to withdraw everything, I think, above 10 pounds, and to put the metallic thread into the white notes. Up until 1944, there had never been any significant security feature. They were still, those notes are pressed, for heaven's sake. They're not even intaglio. The first time I read Brian Burke's book on Bernard and I saw the photographs of the plates, I said, they can't possibly have been using those plates. They're letterpress plates. And then I started examining the notes with high magnification and discovered, well, son of a gun, they were still printing letterpress notes up in the 1950s. this was 19th century technology, but they did have a radical change in there. Well, not so radical. They didn't look that different, but the serial number font was changed for sure. That you instantly tell a metallic thread white note from an earlier one by just looking at the serial number font. And they did withdraw the high denominations from circulation at that point. The Australians did have their $10 note counterfeited. Their last paper note, their last paper 10 was counterfeited with and distributed widely. I have a card that was given to merchants with all the different block letter combinations that were used for this counterfeit. And there must have been, I don't know, maybe 15 different block letter combinations on that card. I do have one of those counterfeits that matches the card in my collection. That is when they went to Polymer, when that note was counterfeited. Other examples, well, it's escaping my mind.
Sorry, Joseph, sorry to interrupt. There is a recent example for Cedrian in India. The 500 rupee and the 1000 rupee note was withdrawn, both denominations overnight, in November of 2016. And 2 years later, we have a new 500, completely new size, new design, and an entire new series. But the 1000 denomination has not yet returned in the new series. So, yeah, they did replace an entire denomination and they haven't yet got a new one back in after the change.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the decision to withdraw all the 500 and 1000 rupee notes in India was not necessarily because of forgeries. It was because people were hoarding those, and it was they claimed that it was kind of financing illegal activities, something like that.
Right, but I mean it was also yes, but financing, the lack of a better word, but cross-border deals, which were obviously not legit. So there were two reasons, but the counterfeiting was also happening, in parallel along with the black money generation. But the thing is, the more important point is that the 1000 was quite a popular denomination because a lot of transactions in India are done in cash. And now in the last 3-4 years, we've really become as non-cash or as close to a digital economy as possible. But it's still very hard because a lot of India still works in a rural framework. And even though I might have a digital interface, the last endpoint user, like a farmer somewhere who doesn't have even an electric connection, obviously can't access that. So they have to actually go and get a physical note at some point. But more importantly, the 1000 was quite a popular payment method, you know what I mean? And that's been out. They replaced it with the 2000s. I mean, it was just the guys who are hoarding the money now could hoard the same amount of money in half the space. But I mean, that's another debate. But they still haven't reintroduced the 1000, and that's kind of surprising because that's it's a good denomination to buy medium, or I guess if you go to one trip to the supermarket, you could shell out that one bill, and it's quite a frequently used denomination, and we still haven't got one back. Sorry to interrupt, Joseph, but I just thought I'll give him a bit of.
Thanks for the clarification.
I can't speak for the rationale. Certainly, it was very damaging to the small user to have those notes removed overnight, and then to limit the amount that you could withdraw from ATMs in the new currencies, and to not bring back a very popular denomination. There's all sorts of weird things going on there. But there were some very high quality counterfeits coming in probably from Pakistan on would look to be genuine paper, perfectly good paper, But there were issues. I mean, these were not intaglio counterfeits. They were lithograph counterfeits on good paper. So for one thing, one security feature that you get in intaglio notes, the latent image, did not work on the lithograph notes. You could not get a latent image. You could simulate a latent image with printing, and I've seen a few of those, but mostly they just ignored the latent image as a security feature and didn't try to replicate it.
I think I can remember a few cases where I seem to remember cases where issues have been removed because of counterfeiting. I can't remember many cases right now, but one that I do remember is in Spain. The Bank of Spain at the beginning of 20th century was pushing to be the printer of record, and the quality of the paper and the counterfeiting started to grow materially, and around 1905 the latest issues by the Bank of Spain printed in Spain were retired because there were quite a few counterfeits, and Bradbury was hired to do the printing. But there are a couple of issues, 1903, 1904, which were counterfeited very heavily, and they were removed.
Okay, I was not aware of that. I don't know if I have any of those. I'd have to look at my Spanish holdings. I don't have a lot of material from Spain.
Bruce, here,
In Mexico,
here is your case of Chinese.
40s, there were a couple of denominations that were forged. I think it was first it was the 100, then the 50, and then also the 20. And the 100 and the 50 were replaced by a different design.
Where was that?
In Mexico. From those notes printed by American Banknote Company.
Okay.
So there was a famous forger that was called Pietro. Actually, there are a couple of books about him, and he managed to forge 3 denominations of them, and the 100 and the 50 were totally withdrawn from circulation, and they issued a new design. That's why these 2 denominations from the 40s, they have two designs. And the 20, they managed to isolate a specific. They didn't print the plate, but there was a countersign printed in Mexico, and they managed to identify specifically which was the code that was being replicated. They withdraw all the 20s in circulation from that specific series. They isolated that specific code, which was a letter number code, and they actually put back in circulation everyone that was not within this code. So that's it, and I think this is a very interesting series to track, specifically for the 20s, dated 1943.
And I don't have any of those, I'm sure.
I have a few of them. I'll show you I'll send you some information and also the pictures of that I have and the notes that I have.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no further questions, can I take this opportunity to ask Joe and Fabrizio, what is the state of the work that you're doing together to document all of this? I realize with the pandemic it's a lot more difficult to continue, but where exactly are you, and what is next?
Well, what is next? My entire collection was photographed over a period of 2 summers, with Fabrizio coming here to do all the photography. Still have to go through and identify the diagnostics on each of those counterfeits and take 20 power photographs of the diagnostics, and in some cases the ultraviolet photographs. Fabrizio did a lot of UV photography as well, but didn't pick up every case where the UV is significant in identifying the counterfeit. I simply haven't had time to address that. I'm supposed to be working on a technical chapter of a book on Operation Bernard right now, and I'm way behind on that. And after that, I have about 13 or 14 cartons of notes, which I have bought dating back to 1993, which had never been placed into my collection, never been inventoried, and never been put in the inventory and identified and what have you. And there's still plenty of counterfeits and genuine pairs mixed in that. So that all has to be accessioned and photographed. So it's going to be a while before we get any of this up on the website.
But if I may add, Joe, I think what we could do first is releasing the photos we've done. So to reply to Amy, basically people can have access to the genuine note and counterfeit. So you can see the photo, but until Joe will take the 20-power photo, people may not understand how to identify the genuine from the counterfeit. So we could even release what we have so far, but until that moment, it may be difficult to understand. Some, I would say, they're quite obvious because they are crude. Some other, you really need to know the details, the diagnostic to understand.
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully I'm not going to expire before I get this done.
No, you don't have to expire. I still have to come there. We have to finish the 13 cartoons. Bruce, I mean, I cannot show it over here. I'll send a photo on the IBNS chat, but this is basically a Chinese specimen out of an original banknote, which I bought before I joined Joe class, and I didn't know about 20-power magnification. And actually, you can't tell, but once you look with the magnification, you can see that somebody scratched away the original number, placed some zero, and then the specimen in Chinese characters.
Yeah, thanks.
I had an entire lecture at Memphis several years ago out of China, which dealt with all of these kinds of replicas that were coming out of China for the collector's market. These were not original circulating counterfeits. They were made for collectors. But the series of 1947 and 48 were demonetized in China, I believe, in 1951. And they were almost immediately then replicated for sale to tourists. So auction houses are always getting these consignments that, oh, my dad picked these up when he was working in Hong Kong back in 1968. And the auction houses don't look at them carefully. Some very reputable houses in Australia have been carrying some of these replicated People's Bank notes without looking at them closely when they take the consignment in, and then the buyer gets the notes and looks at them carefully and says, "Well, these aren't original. What's going on here? Why am I buying these from this auction house?" Anybody who buys a raw PRC note, sight on, is asking for a replica. You just don't get genuine notes anymore. The genuine notes have all been put into slabs.
Joe, how many decent counterfeits have you seen of U.S. $1 bills? I mean, it sounds like a foolish endeavor. I know there's some out there.
Well, I've got several. I've got quite a few, actually. I can't remember what the guy's name was. There was a very famous counterfeiter in New York that was printing $1 bills, only passing 2 or 3. But this was back when $1 was a day's wage, or maybe an hour's wage. There was it's a 3-digit number. It was the number of the plate that he was printing from. But there are quite a few $1 counterfeits from the 1930s and 40s that were created. Nobody's doing them these days, but they were when a dollar was worth something.
Yeah, there was a movie made of one of these characters. I think it was Burt Lancaster, and I think it's Edwin Gwynn played the counterfeiter. I forget the name of it, Mr. 440 or something like that. Maybe you're familiar with it. But
well, I've got an article in a book in the cabinet behind me here, but I'd have to look for a few minutes to find it.
But they were really, really crude counterfeits and easy to detect.
They were, but a circulated note, a well-circulated note doesn't look very good either. So if you took these reasonably crude counterfeits and muddied them up, one interesting thing about the Japanese invasion money counterfeits was that the British counterfeited the Burmese pieces and then artificially circulated them, and the Burmese didn't want them. The Burmese wanted nice, clean, crisp notes. So they had to stop putting the mud on them. But I did buy out of one junk box. I bought 3 pieces, all had their artificial mud on them, of 1 rupee notes from the Burmese British production.
Joe, I would have another question if you don't mind.
Sure.
Have you got an experience with TPGs grading counterfeits as the authentic banknotes?
Yes, I frequently see a note in an auction, and I'll call the folks down at in Sarasota and tell them this is one that you need to buy yourself and get out of the market, and they do that. They contact the auction house and either have the note withdrawn, or they bid on it and buy it at whatever the market is on it and pull it out of the market that way. The most recent was 2 pieces of the Berlin, the B in a circle rubber stamp on the Allied military currency, or actually the Special Army currency, the 1948 series of notes in Germany that were stamped with the B for Berlin, and the B rubber stamp was a counterfeit rubber stamp. There were 2 notes in the same auction. It was a half mark and a 1 mark, and they bought one of them. They didn't understand that there were 2 notes they were supposed to be looking at, and so I bought the other one. And then they cut the one out of the slab that they had bought and sold it to me for their so I got both notes. Mm-hmm. But those are off the market. One of them's still in the slab. Military payment certificates were counterfeit MPCs were slabbed early on. The TPGs finally figured out how to distinguish the counterfeit MPCs and stopped slabbing those. But I've got some Series 471, 1 or 2 10s in slabs. The MPC coupons that were used by the Thai and Korean troops in Vietnam were replicated digitally, and some of those are in slabs or have been in slabs. So you have to, anytime one of those is offered, 20 power is the way to go. They're all lithograph notes, but lithography, high quality lithography is completely different from digital, and all the replicas are digital.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks.
Joe, what is the counterfeit with the highest collector value you've come across? I can think of the Alves dos Reis 500 escudos from Portugal, but any others that have a very high collector value?
Well, that one for sure. I think I spent $6 for mine. Trying to think. Some of the Brazilian pieces, certainly there are multi-$100 pieces in early Brazilian notes that were counterfeited at the time. There was a Latin American collector, and now his name is escaping me, who collected counterfeits along with his other stuff, and Bill got the entire counterfeit collection, and I bought almost all of it intact from Bill, so I got all of those notes for not a lot of money, actually, because they were sold as counterfeits. They were known to be counterfeits, at the time that I bought them. But there have been, in Lynn Knight's auctions particularly, there have been consignments there of counterfeits which were not picked up as counterfeits by the company and identified as counterfeits and had withdrawn from the sales. Had they sold, they would have been multi-$100 pieces as well.
Joe, the 1 pound Gallipoli overprint note, of course, is quite expensive if it's genuine in any kind of decent condition, and there are many counterfeits of those.
Yes, I've got. I do have one genuine, and I have several of the fakes. Interestingly, on the fakes, at least one of the ones I have, the overprint was printed before the black. The red overprint was printed on the paper, and the black was printed over the red. But this is something that can be very difficult to distinguish because a lot of inks, colored inks, are transparent. They look fine on white paper, but if you print them over black, the black shows right through. So to identify a note where the black went on over the red can be, a little bit difficult to figure out. But I've got at least one of those. I love the notes of that series that went through. I have with back stamps for the Army Pay Office in Cairo and the Army Pay Office in Gibraltar, where these notes, these counterfeits, were withdrawn from circulation in military pay officers' operations and back stamped with the stamp of those payroll offices.
You mentioned the Reyes note. Not to get pedantic, but do you really consider that as a counterfeit or just a fraud?
Well, it's certainly a fraud.
Yeah.
The counterfeits can be detected in some cases. Waterloo put identifying letters in microprint on their plates, and the original plates wore out in the reprinting operation. So they put their backup plates, their secondary plates, into production, and they have different letters on the back, and letters that were not used on the original issue. So any note with one of those letters is automatically one of the fraudulent pieces.
Yeah, but the question is that a genuine counterfeit though? Because it's Waterloo that actually is the original engraver, and they just re-engraved some plates.
I understand the distinction you're making. They're certainly collectible as counterfeits, but it would be a hard sell to say that it was truly a counterfeited note, since it was done by the original producer. Same thing with the free Thai notes. They were printed by Delarue, but they're identifiable as secondary operation emissions or non-original issuer emissions. There are other examples like that as well. There have been some printers who weren't all on the up and up either, who passed notes out the back door that should not have been issued. The modern polymer notes, yes, polymer counterfeits. Somebody was asking about that. I've got a lot of Vietnamese polymer counterfeits on genuine polymer. The polymer goes out the back door in China, where it's made, goes straight to a counterfeiter who lithographs the images on the polymer instead of intaglio printing, and then puts them on mules. And I don't mean four-legged mules. I mean people that are carrying notes into Vietnam and then circulates them in Vietnam. I've got several of those that are lithographed on genuine polymer. But you know, there's another case of at what point is it made from original materials? Obviously, if it's lithographed, it's not an original note, but the genuine polymer makes it very difficult to distinguish.
We have a beautiful example of a valuable forgery last week in the presentation from Mark Lazarus on German East Africa. I think you've been discussing that on the forum, but that's a good note.
So what was the question again?
No, I'm saying we have a good example of a valuable counterfeit on the German East Africa that you've been discussing on the forum recently. Mark Lazarus made a presentation last week, and he talked about this counterfeit. I think it's a 20 rupee.
20 rupee note that the British counterfeited during World War I. There's further exchanges on the forum about those notes. I promised Klaus that I would stop talking about that black dot on the note and just talk about the paper varieties. The distinction on that one is that the signatures are not hand signed. All the original notes have hand signed signatures, and the counterfeits are all printed in the plate, so they're easy to distinguish with a good magnification.
And of course, not to open that kind of worms, but the Warrington forger. I mean, all those overprints on the Fezan notes and the Djibouti Free Friends and all those. I think you've been doing a great service to the community, highlighting those, because those are, I mean, when you see them on eBay, it's hard to really tell the good from the bad ones.
Well, the Somali, the block numbers, the blocks that were overprinted are published, and the I don't remember which of the French. We've got Claire, Muzinski, and who?
Kolsky,
right. Three guys wrote a series of books on the French colonial notes, and the Somali notes, the blocks were pulled out of the records. Those blocks that were used are printed in the book, so you can distinguish those easily if you just have at hand the blocks that were used. So I bought a genuine. In fact, I've got it right here. Here's one of those Somali pairs. I don't know. Well, let's see. Let's get it out of the plastic. All right, there's a genuine of that overprint, and it is a letterpress overprint with the letters FC. You see Foxtrot Charlie up here. That's Français combattante, the fighting French. And here's the replica in inkjet done by our fellow in Warrington. Well, this is from alphabet 54, and this is from alphabet 64. I bought this from him as a genuine. It's not one he made. It's the only genuine one he's ever offered. But because he's destroyed the market in them, it didn't cost me a lot of money because it's, nobody wants to buy this kind of stuff from him who knows what they're doing, because they know that just about everything he sells is bad. Let's see if I've got it on here. I think that one cost me about 16 pounds, something like that. Yeah, $22.85. for what should be a $125 note before he destroyed the market in them. But that's the only genuine one of those he's ever peddled. The reason I had two in the holder there is because I used them as show and tell at one of my local club meetings a couple of years ago, and I've never moved them back out of the holders side by side. This stack right here, these are all notes from the Warrington Faker. Everything in this pack of rubber bands are from the Warrington Faker.
You're his best client, huh?
Say again?
You are his best client.
Well, I may be. Although at this point, because he's coming up with all these fantasies, I'm not buying all of those. I do buy some of them, but every time he prints something new on a watermark window, I record it. I keep track of everything he sells every week. And you can see that the same serial number will repeat 2 or 3 times. His record is 5 sales of one Fazan note. It sold 5 times before somebody finally kept it. Because people look at him and they say, this isn't a legitimate marking. Back, and he makes instant refunds. He always gets positive feedback because he makes instant refunds, never objects to anything. So he's a very good eBay seller, but eventually somebody always ends up with something that they're going to regret later. The most egregious ones are the Pakistani pieces, where he's taking Indian notes and printing the Pakistani English and Urdu print on there. Those were printed at Nasik in the plate. Those are not overprints on finished notes. Those notes were created from whole cloths at the Nasik facility from plates that had the Pakistani markings already in them. So no Pakistani piece of that series should be an overprint. They should all be right in the plate, same shade of, the 2 rupee is that pink 2 rupee. And he gets anywhere from 150 to 250 pounds for every one of those that he fabricates. It's a good business for him. He's very good with his Photoshop. He lifted the Fazan overprint from Ruth Hill's note that was on the Heritage website and has been using that for quite a while now for Fazan. Her piece had the rectangular stamp hanging off the edge of the note a little bit, so the corner didn't get on the note. Well, the first 2 or 3 he sold had that truncated corner, but then he repaired the corner on his image. So now it's her image, except that it's got 4 full corners on it. Oh, he's a good manipulator.
Joe, everyone, I hate to do this, but I have told the end. We're going to have the IBNS board meeting in half an hour or so. So again, thank you, Joe, and say hello to Louise and take care of yourself. And yeah, I'll come soon to check the 13 boxes.
Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do with those.
And to everyone else, thank you for joining. And next month, early next month, there will be the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Be
Thank
safe.
you.
Bye. Bye-bye now.